Imagine a world where mountains are not just rocks but gods, where gold is not money but the sweat of the sun, and where a small tribe lost in a high Andean valley manages in less than 1 century to build the largest empire the Western Hemisphere has ever seen. This is not a fantasy legend, it is the story of Tahuantinsuyo, the Inca Empire, a civilization that defied gravity, climate, and sheer altitude to unite more than 12 million people under a single rule. Stretching from present-day Colombia to central Chile, across the snow-capped peaks of 6 modern countries. Like, subscribe, and share. Let's begin. It all begins with an origin myth that echoes in the waters of Lake Titicaca. According to tradition, the sun god Inti sent his children Manco Capac and Mama Ocolo to civilize the people who lived like beasts in caves. He gave them a golden staff and an order. Wherever the staff sank effortlessly into the earth, they were to found the center of the world. After a long search, the staff disappeared into the fertile soil of the Cusco Valley. There, among the sacred mountains, the city that would become the navel of the world was born. But for centuries, the Incas were just a small local chiefdom, constantly fighting for water and land against much more powerful neighboring tribes, such as the fierce Chancas. The moment that changed world history occurred in the year 1438. The Chancas, a confederation of brutal warriors, besieged Cusco. The elderly Inca king and his heir fled, believing the city lost. However, a young prince named Kusi Yupanqui refused to surrender. Legend says that the prince's desperation was so great that the stones of the battlefield transformed into stone soldiers to fight alongside him. The prince not only defeated the Chancas but also crowned himself with a new name, Pachacuti, which in Quechua means "he who transforms the world." Pachacuti was the true architect of the empire. He didn't just win battles, he redesigned reality. He was the Alexander the Great of the Americas, a military and administrative genius who understood that to maintain an empire, force alone wasn't enough. Organization was essential. Under his rule, Cusco ceased to be a mud village and became an imperial city of polished stone, laid out in the shape of a sacred puma. He established Quechua as the official language and designed a road system that would connect the 4 corners of the known world, creating Tahuantinsuyo, the kingdom of the 4 regions. But the rise of the Incas was not solely a conquest by bloodshed. Pachacuti and his successors, such as Tupac Yupanqui and Huayna Capac, perfected the art of gift diplomacy. Before attacking a people, they sent ambassadors bearing fine vicuña textiles, gold, and food. They offered them the opportunity to join the empire voluntarily. If they accepted, the local leader retained his power under the Incas' authority. If they refused, the Inca army, the most disciplined on the continent, wiped them off the map. This expansion was so rapid that in just 3 generations, the Incas had increased their territory 100-fold, absorbing ancient cultures such as the Chimu on the coast and the Aymara kingdoms in the highlands. The geography they dominated is among the most extreme on the planet. The Andes are a labyrinth of abysses, coastal deserts and impenetrable jungles. For the Incas, nature was not an obstacle but a sacred ally. They understood microclimates and developed such advanced agriculture that they could produce food surpluses where today only weeds survive. This ability to feed millions of people was the true secret of their power. A people with full stomachs does not rebel, and the Incas ensured that no one went hungry in their domains. Pachacuti also established the state religion centered on the sun. The Inca was not just a king, he was the Sapa Inca, the only Inca, the direct son of the sun and the mediator between the gods and men. His power was absolute because it was divine. When the Inca walked, the ground trembled. When he spoke, his word was cosmic law. However, this power came with a burden. The Inca had to maintain the balance of the universe through complex rituals and the care of his people. Thus, the children of the sun went from being a small tribe to masters of the Andes. But organizing such a vast territory without horses, without knowledge of iron, and without a writing system like the European one required a different technology. A technology of organization that continues to amaze archaeologists today. They were on the verge of creating a society where time was measured in knots and where stones spoke of eternity. The Inca Empire was not a country in the modern sense, but a living organism that functioned with clockwork precision. The name itself says it all. Tahua means 4 and Suyo means region. These 4 sectors, Chinchaysuyo, Colasuyo, Antisuyo, and Contisuyo, converged on the main plaza of Cusco, demonstrating that for the Incas, politics and sacred geometry were one and the same. But how did they manage to control a territory of more than 2 million square kilometers without an alphabetic writing system? The answer lies in one of the most fascinating tools in history, the quipu. The quipu was a computer made of cords and knots. Through different colors, types of wool, and knot positions, specialists called quipucamayaks could record absolutely everything, from the amount of corn in a warehouse to the number of births in a remote village, including military censuses and historical chronicles. It was a tactile and visual language that allowed the Sapa Inca to have an exact snapshot of his empire in real time. Thanks to this system, the state knew precisely where food was lacking and where there was a surplus of labor, enabling a redistribution of resources that prevented famines, an achievement few European empires of the time could boast. The foundation of this efficiency was the social system of the Ailu. The Ailu was a community united by kinship ties that worked the land collectively. Under this model, private property as we understand it today did not exist. The land belonged to the Inca, but it was given to families for their sustenance. In exchange, adult citizens fulfilled the mita, a tribute in the form of labor. Some built bridges, others worked in the mines, and still others served in the army. This exchange of human labor for protection and food created a society without currency, where the true value was time and shared effort. For this system to work, communication had to be fast. Therefore, the Incas built the Capacnan, a road network of more than 30,000 kilometers that climbed mountains and crossed deserts. To carry messages through this labyrinth, they created the chasqui, elite young runners who operated using a relay system. A chasqui would run at full speed to a tambo, a rest stop, where he would hand the message or the quipu to the next runner. It is said that this system was so fast that the Inca could eat fresh fish brought from the coast to the Andes in less than 24 hours. But control wasn't just logistical, it was also demographic. The Incas used a technique called amaze. When they conquered a rebellious people, they relocated entire groups of people to distant, peaceful regions, replacing them with loyalists. This served not only to prevent revolts, but also to spread the culture, the Sun religion, and the Quechua language throughout the continent. Quechua became the lingua franca of the Andes, allowing someone from northern Ecuador to communicate with someone from central Argentina. The Inca economy was, in essence, a system of massive storage. They built thousands of colcas, circular stone storehouses, in high, well-ventilated locations to preserve food for years. If a region suffered a drought, the Inca would order the colcas open to feed the population. This concept of reciprocity was the basis of the social contract. The people worked for the Inca because the Inca was the great provider and the guarantor of cosmic order. However, ruling an empire of such magnitude across one of the world's most rugged landscapes required more than just roads and paths. It demanded engineering that seemed the work of the gods. The Incas were about to raise walls that would defy earthquakes and cities that would touch the clouds, leaving a stone imprint that neither time nor conquerors could erase. When modern explorers stand before the walls of Sacsayhuaman or gaze upon the silhouette of Machu Picchu, the same question always arises. How did they do it? The Incas didn't know iron, they didn't use the wheel for transporting goods, and they didn't have draft animals like oxen or horses. Yet, they achieved a perfection in stone carving that surpasses almost any other ancient civilization. Their technique, known as Silla architecture, consisted of fitting together multi-ton blocks of stone with such precision that it's impossible to insert a razor blade between them. They didn't use mortar or cement. The stones were held together by the sheer force of gravity and a three-dimensional interlocking design that makes them virtually indestructible. The true genius of Inca engineering wasn't just aesthetic, but also earthquake-resistant. The Andes are one of the most seismically active regions on the planet. The Incas understood that a rigid structure will crumble in an earthquake, so they designed their walls with a slight inward tilt and with stones at multiple angles that could dance during a tremor. When the earth shakes, the stones shift slightly and then snap back into their original positions. While Spanish colonial temples collapsed time and again, the Inca walls remained unshaken, defying nature with a technology of stability that continues to amaze structural engineers today. But the greatest challenge wasn't just construction, but survival on the mountainside. To feed a constantly growing population in a territory with few flat valleys, the Incas invented agricultural terraces. They transformed entire mountains into gigantic staircases for cultivation. These terraces weren't simple earthen steps, they were complex feats of hydraulic engineering. Each terrace had layers of coarse stone, sand, and fertile soil to allow drainage and prevent torrential rains from eroding the mountain. Furthermore, the stone walls of the terraces absorbed the sun's heat during the day and released it at night, creating microclimates that allowed them to grow corn and potatoes at altitudes where nothing would normally grow. Machu Picchu, the city in the clouds, is the ultimate example of this harmony between humankind and the environment. Built on a narrow ridge between two sacred peaks, The city is a marvel of water management. Inca engineers designed a system of stone channels that brought water from natural springs throughout the city, feeding 16 consecutive fountains. But what is most impressive is what remains unseen. More than 60% of Machu Picchu's construction is underground. It consists of deep foundations and massive drainage systems that have prevented the city from sliding down the mountainside after 5 centuries of Amazonian rains. The spiritual center of this engineering marvel was the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Chroniclers recount that when the Spanish arrived, the temple walls were covered with more than 700 sheets of pure gold, each weighing 2 kilograms. In its inner garden, there were replicas of corn, llamas, and shepherds made entirely of gold and silver. For the Incas, the beauty of polished stone and the brilliance of gold were ways of honoring the perfection of divine creation. Gold was not a store of economic value, but rather the physical representation of sunlight captured in the earth. In addition to walls and temples, the Incas mastered the abysses with suspension bridges. Using ichu fibers, high-altitude grass, braided with incredible strength, they built bridges over 40 meters long that spanned raging rivers. These bridges were so vital that their maintenance was a sacred task of the Mita. They were renewed each year in ritual ceremonies. Without these bridges, the movement of armies and messengers along the Chapacnan would have been impossible, leaving the empire isolated by the Andean ravines. Inca engineering did not seek to dominate nature, but to integrate with it. They did not cut mountains, they sculpted them. They did not aggressively divert rivers, they guided them. This worldview, where stone had life and mountains were conscious beings, allowed them to create a cultural landscape unique in the world. But all this physical and administrative structure depended on a single central figure, a man who was seen as a god on earth and whose will moved the mountains. The Sapa Inca. Then like, subscribe and share until the next one. In the heart of the Inca Empire, it was not an ordinary man who ruled, but a living god. The Sapa Inca, the only Inca, was considered the direct son of the sun, the embodiment of light on earth and the axis around which the entire Andean universe revolved. His power was so absolute that no one could look him directly in the eyes, and his subjects had to approach him barefoot and carrying a small load on their backs as a sign of humility. For the people, the Inca was not a land administrator, but the guarantor that the sun would rise each morning and that the rain would fall on time for the crops. The life of the Sapa Inca was shrouded in mystical opulence. He wore the finest vicuna wool fabrics in the world, so delicate that he only wore them once before they were ritually burned so that no one else could ever touch them. His food was brought from every corner of the empire and served on gold and silver tableware. But the most fascinating aspect of the Inca theocracy was its relationship with death. The Incas did not believe that a king's power ended with his last breath. When a Sapa Inca died, his body was mummified using secret techniques that preserved its almost lifelike appearance for centuries. These royal mummies, called Malki, continued to actively participate in the political life of Cusco. They were treated as if they were alive. They had servants who fanned them. They were served food and drink. And they were carried in procession during sacred festivals such as Inti Raymi. Most incredibly, the mummies retained all their properties and lands. Each deceased Inca formed a panaka, or the royal lineage, which administered its wealth. This forced the new Inca to conquer new territories, since he did not inherit the lands of his predecessor, which continued to belong to the deceased's mummy. This constant need for expansion was the driving force behind the empire's unbridled growth. Sun worship was the backbone of the state religion. The Coricancha temple in Cusco functioned as the world's energy center, from which imaginary lines called seques connected hundreds of sacred sites or huacas throughout the empire. The religious administration had the Akla. The virgins of the sun were women selected from childhood for their beauty and skills to live in the temples. They were responsible for weaving the Incas' clothes and preparing chicha, the sacred corn beverage used in all ceremonies. Some of them became secondary wives of the Inca, while others remained consecrated to the sun for life. Inca spirituality was deeply connected to Pachamama, Mother Earth. Sacrifices were an essential part of their worldview for maintaining cosmic balance. Although most offerings consisted of seashells, spondylus, coca, chicha, or llamas, in times of extreme crisis such as severe droughts or the death of an Inca, the capacocha was practiced. This was the ritual sacrifice of children and young people selected for their physical perfection. They were taken to the highest peaks of the Andes, such as the Lulailaco volcano, where, after being drugged with chicha, they were given to the mountain gods to become eternal guardians of the empire. Reciprocity was the theological concept that maintained social peace. The Inca would offer lavish banquets of food and drink in public squares. and in return, the people would willingly work in the Mita system. It was a system of forced generosity. The Inca could not demand labor unless he had first proven himself to be a generous father. This mystical connection between the ruler and the land created one of the most stable and productive societies in human history. However, this sacred order, which seemed eternal, was about to crumble. Infinite expansion had its limits, and the laws of the royal Panacas sowed the seeds of ambition and conflict. While the empire reached its zenith under Huayna Capac, dark omens began to appear on the horizon, unknown diseases and bearded men coming from the sea. The kingdom of the four regions was about to face its most difficult test, not against gods, but against the ambition of its own people. The splendor of the Inca Empire reached its zenith under the reign of Huayna Capac, the third great unifier. During his rule, the empire expanded into what is now Colombia, consolidating a territory so vast that the Inca himself chose to spend much of his time in the northern city of Quito, making it a sort of second capital. However, amidst this apparent stability, the empire's fate began to unravel due to factors no Inca oracle could have foreseen. In the final years of his life, Huayna Capac received disturbing news. A strange disease, which covered the skin in pustules and caused a swift and painful death, was ravaging the northern provinces. It was smallpox, an invisible enemy brought by the Europeans that spread through the Andes far faster than the conquistadors themselves. Tragedy struck at the heart of power when Huayna Capac himself and his designated heir, Niñan Cuyuchi, died from an epidemic in 1527. According to Inca law, succession was not strictly based on primogeniture. Instead, the throne was to pass to the most capable son among the nobles of royal blood. The simultaneous deaths of the Inca and his successor left a catastrophic power vacuum, which was soon claimed by two of his sons, Huáscar, who had the support of the traditional nobility of Cusco, and Atahualpa, who enjoyed the backing of the experienced northern army and his father's most brilliant generals. What began as a political dispute quickly escalated into a fratricidal war of apocalyptic proportions. Huáscar was crowned in Cusco, but his erratic nature and attempts to confiscate the lands of the royal mummies, the Panacas, to consolidate his own power, earned him the enmity of the Cusco elite. Meanwhile, Atahualpa from Quito refused to pay homage to his brother, arguing that he was the true heir to their father's warrior spirit. Civil war erupted with a ferocity never before seen in the Andes. For several years, the two halves of the empire bled each other dry in massive battles. The roads that once served for trade and communication now saw armies of tens of thousands of soldiers wielding stone clubs and bronze axes. Determined to annihilate their own countrymen, the tide finally turned in Atahualpa's favor after the Battle of Quipaipan near Cusco. His generals, Quizquiz and Chalcuchimac, captured Huáscar and subjected the imperial capital to brutal repression. Feeling victorious, Atahualpa began his march from the north toward Cusco to be officially crowned Sapa Inca. It was during this journey, while resting in the thermal baths of Cajamarca, that he received reports of a small group of strange men riding giant animals and wearing metal clothing that gleamed in the sun. Confident after winning the largest war in Inca history, Atahualpa saw these 168 foreigners not as a real threat, but as a curiosity to be investigated and possibly sacrificed. However, the empire Atahualpa believed he had unified was in reality fractured. Civil war had not only decimated the population, but had also destroyed the infrastructure and eroded trust in central authority. Many peoples conquered by the Incas, weary of the yoke of Cusco or fearful of Atahualpa's brutality, saw in the newcomers an opportunity to regain their independence. The Spanish, led by Francisco Pizarro, astutely exploited this weakness. They presented themselves as liberators to the disaffected tribes, gaining crucial allies who would provide them with supplies, warriors, and guides. The omens that the priests had observed for years, solar eclipses, comets crossing the sky, and lightning strikes on sacred temples were beginning to make sense. The Andean worldview was based on cycles of destruction and renewal called Pachacuti. For many, the arrival of these bearded men and the ensuing fratricidal war marked the end of a cosmic cycle. Atahualpa agreed to meet Pizarro in the plaza of Cajamarca on November 16, 1532, surrounded by thousands of his unarmed soldiers as a sign of peace and superiority. What transpired in that plaza was not a battle, but an ambush that changed the course of history. The Inca was captured in a moment of utter chaos, and with his capture, the heart of Tahuantinsuyo ceased to beat. The largest empire in the Americas, weakened by the virus and internal conflict, was about to face its ultimate demise under the weight of a ransom of gold and the betrayal of a new world. The capture of Atahualpa in the plaza of Cajamarca was an event that defied all logic of the time. In just a few minutes, a handful of Spanish adventurers using firearms and horses, animals the Incas had never seen, dismantled the head of an empire that boasted armies of hundreds of thousands. From his captivity, Atahualpa quickly understood that the only thing motivating these foreigners was an insatiable thirst for precious metals. In a desperate attempt to buy his freedom and gain time for his generals to regroup, he offered the most legendary ransom in human history: to fill a room approximately 7 meters long by 5 meters wide with pure gold, up to the height of his outstretched hand, and twice the same room with silver. For months, the Capacnan network throbbed under the weight of caravans bringing treasures from the empire's most sacred temples. Gold plates from the walls of the Coricancha, statues from magical gardens, and tableware from royal mummies piled up in Cajamarca. Incalculable works of art representing centuries of Andean cosmogony were melted down and turned into ingots. However, the ransom payment did not bring freedom. Pizarro, fearing a massive attack from Atahualpa's generals who still controlled the north, decided to get rid of the Inca. In July 1533, Atahualpa was executed on charges of fratricide and rebellion. With his death, the cosmic order of the Tahuantinsuyo crumbled completely. The Son of the Sun had died at the hands of men who did not respect the divinity of the mountains. The Spanish then marched toward Cusco, the sacred capital. Despite the heroic resistance of generals like Quizquiz, the technological superiority of the steel armor and Toledo swords, coupled with the massive support of thousands of indigenous enemies of the Incas, such as the Canaris and the Huancas, allowed the Europeans to enter the navel of the world in November 1533. The temples were looted, and the mummies of the former emperors, treated as gods for generations, were desecrated and hidden. Pizarro installed a puppet Inca, Manco Inca, believing he could rule through him. But Manco Inca soon realized that the Spanish were neither gods nor liberators, but conquerors seeking to eradicate his culture. In 1536, Manco Inca managed to escape and organize the largest rebellion in colonial history. He besieged the city of Cusco with over 100,000 warriors, burning the thatched roofs to suffocate the Spanish and recapturing the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. For a moment it seemed the empire would rise from the ashes. However, the arrival of Spanish reinforcements and the start of the planting season, which forced the peasant soldiers to return to their lands to avoid famine, compelled Manco Inca to retreat. He took refuge in the dense jungles of Vilcabamba, establishing a neo-Inca state that would endure for almost 40 years, keeping traditions, quipus, and sun worship alive far from the reach of the cross and the sword. The final resistance ended in 1572, when the last Inca of Vilcabamba, Tupac Amaru I, was captured by the troops of Viceroy Francisco de Toledo. He was taken to Cusco and beheaded in the main square before a crowd of indigenous people who wept inconsolably at the death of their last hope. With his execution, the royal lineage of the Children of the Sun was officially severed. The colonial administration hastened to erase any vestige of Inca power, replacing temples with churches and terraces with haciendas. Nevertheless, the empire did not entirely die. It was submerged in the DNA and memory of the Andean peoples. The Inca legacy is one of the world's most powerful heritages. The Quechua language is still spoken by millions of people from Ecuador to Argentina. Terrace farming techniques still feed entire communities in the most remote valleys, and the philosophy of Aini, or reciprocity, remains the social glue of the Andes. Machu Picchu, rediscovered by the outside world in 1911, stands today as a symbol of the resilience of a civilization that, without knowledge of the wheel or European writing, managed to build a stone paradise in the clouds. The story of the Inca Empire is a reminder that the greatness of a people is not measured by its gold, but by its ability to harmonize human ambition with the sacred spirit of the land. Next, like, subscribe, and share until the next one.